Good morning to our listeners on Parliament Radio 105.5 FM, our viewers on the Parliament channel, and those of you joining us via the World Wide Web on the Parliament's website, www.ttparliament.org. We are less than 1 minute away from the start of today's sitting of the Senate. On the agenda today, the consideration of motions such as occurred in the House of Representatives last Friday to increase the borrowing limit under 3 different pieces of legislation. These motions are to be piloted by the Minister of Finance, the Honorable Colm Imbert, who is already in the chamber. So we expect a debate that will go into the evening today. We take you over now to the Parliament chamber for the start of today's proceedings.
The Honorable the President.
We welcome you to the 7th sitting of the Senate in the first session of the 11th Parliament that takes place on Tuesday, December 8th, 2015.
Let us pray. Almighty God, we willingly acknowledge you as the Supreme Being, most gracious and most merciful. Look down, we beseech you, on us who are members of this Senate, and deign to assist us in the duties that we have to perform on behalf of our beloved country of Trinidad and Tobago. Open our eyes to see the truth and help us to accept it with all its implications into our lives. Direct us, O Lord, in our deliberations, so that setting aside private interests, unwholesome prejudices, and personal affections, we may treat all matters set before us with honesty, courage, and conviction. Through all we say and do in this Senate, may we give glory and honor to your holy name, inspire confidence in our fellow citizens, and make a positive contribution to the peace and prosperity of our nation. Amen.
Announcements by the President.
Honorable Senators, I have granted leave of absence to Senator Daniel Solomon, who is out of the country. Honorable Senators, I have received the following correspondence from His Excellency the President, Anthony Thomas Aquinas, SC, ORTT. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, by His Excellency Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, ORTT SC, President and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. To Mr. Wayne Anthony Monroe. Whereas Daniel Solomon is incapable of performing his duties as a senator by reason of his absence from Trinidad and Tobago, now therefore I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by Section 44(1)(a) and Section 44(4)(b) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby appoint you, Wayne Anthony Monroe, to be temporarily a member of the Senate with effect from the 7th of December 2015 and continuing during the absence from Trinidad and Tobago of the said Senator Daniel Solomon. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President, St. Anne's, the 7th day of December 2015. Honorable Senators, Senators are required to take the oath. Please stand.
I, Wayne Monroe, having been appointed Member of Parliament do solemnly affirm that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibility to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, upon which I am about to enter.
Honourable Senators, there is another senator to be sworn in, but we are awaiting the relevant correspondence, so we will revert to this item when the correspondence arrives. Honourable members, I am in receipt of correspondence from the Deputy Speaker of the House. December the 4th, 2015, Senator the Honourable Christine Kangaloo, President of the Senate. Dear President of the Senate, appointment of members to joint select committees. Please be informed that at a sitting held on Friday, the 27th, November the 27th, 2015, the House of Representatives appointed Dr. Boendra Tiwari to serve on the Joint Select Committee to consider and report on a bill entitled the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Property Amendment Bill 2015, and Mr. Prakash Ramada, MP, to serve on the Joint Select Committee to consider and report on a bill entitled the Whistleblower Protection Bill 2015. Accordingly, I respectfully request that you inform the Senate of these matters, please. Thank you. Respectfully, Esmond Ford, MP, Deputy Speaker.
Bills brought from the House of Representatives, petitions, papers.
Honourable Vice President.
Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers listed on the order paper in my name. Special Report Number 1 of 2015 of the Ombudsman of Trinidad and Tobago, submitted under Section 96(4) of the Constitution.
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Minister of Finance.
Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed in the order paper in my name. The report on the 9th Actuarial Review of the National Insurance System as of June 30th, 2013. The second reports of the Auditor General of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago on the financial statements of the Superior Regional Corporation for the years ended September 30th, 2007, September 30th, 2008.
The Honourable Minister of Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I have the honor to lay on the table the following papers as listed on the order paper in the names of the Minister of National Security and the Minister of Social Development and Family Services. The Immigration Amendment Regulations 2015 and the Senior Citizens Pension Amendment of Schedule Order 2015.
Reports from committees, urgent questions.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. To the Honorable Minister of Finance. Could the Minister of Finance inform the Senate of the specific measures the government intends to take to forestall any further decline in the economy, given recent statements by the Governor of the Central Bank that the economy is officially in recession?
Thank you, Madam President. And before I speak, let me congratulate Senator Mark for wearing a suit. Madam President, the official source of data with respect to the economy is the Central Statistical Office. This is well known to former members of the former government, including the Honorable Senator. The central bank is not a source of economic data. As a consequence, we are checking with the Central Statistical Office to determine whether there is any concurrence with the statements made by the Governor of the Central Bank. You might recall, Madam President, that during the budget presentation in this place in October, I made the point, and it's a matter of public record, that the Central Statistical Office was predicting a 1% growth in the economy for 2015, whereas the Central Bank was predicting a 1% decline. And at that time, I made the point then, as I make now, that for the last 40 years, throughout all successive administrations, including the one of which Senator Mark was a part, the authoritative source for statistical data with respect to the economy is the Central Statistical Office. In these circumstances, it would be premature and precipitous to simply accept the statements made by the Governor without checking with the CSO first. Thank you.
Madam President, could the Honorable Minister of Finance tell this House whether there exists a conflict between the Governor of the Central Bank and the Minister of Finance as it relates to whether Trinidad and Tobago's economy is in a recession or not?
Senator Mark, that doesn't qualify as a supplemental based on the question posed and the answer given.
Could I ask a question again? Through you, Madam President, could the Honorable Minister of Finance indicate to this House when does he expect his consultation to be concluded with the Central Statistical Office so that the country would be in a better position to understand the state of our national economy?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. This is not something that one rushes into. Otherwise, one might jump to the wrong conclusions. I am not going to rush the CSO with respect to this matter. I expect within a few weeks they will be able to give me the answer that I require.
Senator Mark.
To the Honorable Minister of Finance, could the Minister of Finance inform this Senate as to the measures being taken by the government to protect and safeguard the declining foreign exchange reserves against further erosion?
Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I think it's a matter of public record. I think the Honorable Senator should be aware that I answered a question in this place, I think it was 2 weeks ago, where I indicated to the Honorable Senator, and I assume he took note, that at the current foreign exchange reserve level, which is just in the vicinity of about 9.6 billion US dollars, we have 11 months of import cover. The international benchmark, the common rule of thumb for adequate foreign reserve cover is 3 months. So Trinidad and Tobago is at 11 months. And if one examines all the indicators, we are well above the requirements for foreign exchange cover. While it is a fact, and this is something I also said, I would hope that the Honorable Senator would remember
that the conversions at the commercial banks have been declining, and this is public knowledge. The newspapers are full of this information today. In fact, I saw an advertisement by Republic Bank, which has accurate figures, that the conversions of foreign exchange in the commercial market in 2013 were of the order of $5.8 billion US, with a steady demand of $7 billion in the economy for foreign exchange on an annual basis. As a result, in 2013, the central bank put about $1.3 billion into the system to top up the 5.8 being converted by the earners of foreign exchange. That fell to 5.5 in 2014, and it is anticipated in 2015, as a consequence of falling commodity prices, that the conversions of foreign exchange into the commercial banking system by earners of foreign exchange will be of the vicinity of maybe $4.6 billion, which has already caused the central bank to put $2.6 billion into the system for this year. We are monitoring the situation, as I said before. And with 11 months of import cover, I do not think there's any need for us to do anything precipitous at this point in time.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister indicate to this House, given the fact that we have 11 months coverage of import coverage, and given the recent plummeting in the prices of both crude oil and gas, whether, as Minister of Finance, he is at all concerned with the stability of our foreign exchange reserves in Trinidad and Tobago.
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. I will try and say this as clearly as possible. When we had the budget debate, I pointed out that we did not expect significant earnings from the oil and gas sector in fiscal 2016. The budget was pegged at a price of $45 for the basket of crudes in Trinidad and Tobago. And even though that was said, I noticed that a number of commentators are of the view that the WTI price should be the benchmark. I made it very clear that the basket of crudes was pegged at $45 with a WTI price of $41. Now, WTI did drop below 40 yesterday, but it has been averaging in that range, $41 and so on, for the last couple weeks. The price of oil did not suddenly drop. The price of oil has been dropping for 18 months, so that we are constantly managing the inflows of foreign exchange. We're looking at import cover. We have no intention of moving the rate at this point in time, and we can manage the situation. Thank you, Madam President.
For the supplemental, Madam President.
Senator Mark, will you give way to Senator Mavia? Yes.
Thank you very much, Madam President, for allowing me to pose this further supplemental question to the Honourable Minister of Finance. Honourable Minister of Finance, could you inform this Honourable House how the quantum of reserves, that is the absolute quantity of foreign reserves that we have, has behaved over the last 3 months? Has it fallen? If it has fallen, by how much? Thank you very much.
Madam President, with due respect to the Honourable Senator, I did come into this place 2 weeks ago. In response to a question, I said that the foreign reserves was 10.3 billion in September and is now 9.6. And if one looks at the pattern, that's what's been happening. It's been a fluctuation, and the drop from 10.3 to 9.6 is a direct consequence of the injection of $500 million. Do the maths.
So reserves have fallen. That's the answer.
No, no,
I indicated that 2 weeks ago.
That is, we are only allowed 2 questions, 2 supplementals on an urgent question.
Questions on notice, questions for oral answer.
Senator Mark.
Thank you, Madam President. Question number 2 to the Honourable Minister of Finance.
Minister of Finance.
Yeah, just 1 second, Madam. President. Which question is this, Madam President? I have them here.
Question number 2.
2. Thank you very much. Madam President, at the request of the government, an IMF team visited this country over the period 18th of September to the 25th of September 2015. The mission examined a number of sectors of the economy, including the real sector, and its impact on economic activity. In addition, this team looked at monetary development and the government's fiscal operations. At the conclusion of the mission, the IMF team held discussions with officials of the Ministry of Finance, including the Minister. Madam President, this was an informal visit. It was not an Article 4 consultation. It was not a formal communication. The IMF team's findings are presently being discussed at the IMF's head office as part of their normal surveillance of IMF member countries. It is expected that in the first half of 2016, the usual Article 4 consultations will take place. There will be an official visit from the IMF, the usual discussions with all stakeholders, and the usual Article 4 report from the IMF at some later point in 2016. As a consequence, there is no report on the recent visit of the IMF to Trinidad and Tobago.
Madam President, would the Honourable Minister be prepared to share with this Honourable House some of the findings that he mentioned in his response that the IMF was able to locate through their visit to the Ministry of Finance and to the country?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, many of the findings of the informal IMF visit have found their way into the budget presentation and the budget debate. Suffice it to say that the findings of the informal IMF team are consistent with the findings of the government with respect to the state that the economy was left in after the demise of the former administration. Apart from that, I would not be able to disclose the contents of our discussions.
Madam President, the Honourable Minister indicated to this House that these findings are secret and therefore the House would not be able to be privy to those findings.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I would say again, it was an informal visit. The findings are not formal. The IMF has a formalized method of communication with all of its member countries, as the Senator is perfectly well aware, having been a government minister for several years, and I believe the longest serving opposition senator in this place. He knows that the way the IMF communicates with countries is through the Article 4 consultations. If I were to disclose the informal discussions, I would be guilty of a breach of confidentiality. And there's far too much of that taking place in this country today. So I'm afraid I cannot disclose the confidential, informal consultations that we had. I have no intention of running afoul of any confidentiality provisions, whether in law or otherwise.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, through you again, could the Honourable Minister explain to this House why then did that informal meeting find its way in an official budget document which was tabled in this Honourable House if these findings and meeting was so informal? Why was it in the budget statement of 2015-2016? Could the Honourable Minister share with the Senate why?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Since the Honourable Senator is pressing me, the informal team found that the last government had exhausted the cash reserves in the central bank, had sent the government overdraft to almost $9 billion, had pledged the Green Fund and the Unemployment Fund against the overdraft, had raided the National Gas Corporation of $14 billion in cash, had increased our debt-to-GDP ratio to 46%. The informal IMF team simply confirmed what we had suspected all the time, that the last administration mismanaged the economy. That's what you want to know? That's what they found.
Senator Mark. Next question, Senator Mark.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, question number 8 to the Honorable Minister of Finance.
Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Before I begin, it's interesting, both urgent questions were from Senator Mark to me. All 4 questions are from Senator Mark to me, and I'm sure he will be responding to the debate on the matters before us today. I do not wish to say welcome back, Senator Mark. Madam President, this government intends to establish control over the negative impact of transfer pricing manipulation through the introduction of transfer pricing legislation, regulations, and audit, with a view to protecting our tax base while avoiding double taxation that would hamper our competitiveness for investment and trade. As multinational enterprises are said to account for about 60% of world trade, transfer pricing has become the #1 issue in the international tax arena. In fact, Madam President, at a conference in London last year, I recall that on the agenda, and this was on an economic conference, I recall that one of the main items on the agenda was transfer pricing, and we were told that over 100 countries have already formalized legislation or regulations with respect to dealing with leakage of taxation through transfer pricing. But in Trinidad and Tobago, in the absence of a transfer pricing regime and a mechanism for monitoring and assessing transfer pricing manipulations, the estimated value of the consequential revenue leakage is difficult to determine. It would be imprudent for me to give you a figure. We just know that transfer pricing is taking place, and it is when we put the legislation in place and we put an audit system in place, then we will be able to quantify the exact numbers. These manipulations can be formally assessed on a case-by-case basis after specific audits have been conducted, which would take considerable time and resources. The experience of other countries is that these audits, these transfer pricing audits, can take up to 2 to 3 years because of the complexity. However, it is noted that tax administrations which have implemented transfer pricing regulations have reported significant additional revenue collected that represents several times the investment made in the tax administration and development of transfer pricing infrastructure. The focus has always been in this country on direct taxation, corporation tax, but it is obvious that customs duties and value-added tax can take a direct hit from transfer pricing. Transfer pricing influences the level of both direct and indirect taxes that governments will collect, as the potential exists through under or overpricing of the common duties basis and allocation of profits. It is grounded in Article 9 of the OECD and UN Model Tax Conventions, which establish arm's length principles. In short, the arm's length principle requires that related parties price their transactions with each other as if they were wholly independent parties. It ultimately seeks to allocate taxable profits between related parties to achieve a fair allocation of tax revenues among tax authorities. The Inland Revenue Division has identified a number of areas which are relevant to transfer pricing. The transfer of components and finished products between plants in different countries, transfer of assets from one branch or company to another, loans, management fees, guarantee fee, contra entries, for example, withholding taxes, finance charges, expatriates, procurement services, conduit companies, and intangibles. These are all mechanisms that multinationals use to avoid proper levels of taxation. In other words, as an example, if there's a subsidiary country in another country, they would make a charge to the company here at an inflated price and then charge that as an expense, thereby avoiding proper taxation levels. Part B. Although transfer pricing mechanisms are predominantly concerned with cross-border transactions, we need to also look at our domestic legislation in the context of the international framework. The implementation of transfer pricing legislation and regulation is a significant and complex undertaking. It requires intensive training of specialists in tax administration and will apply to all subsidiaries of multinationals in Trinidad and Tobago. The benefits include the establishment of a tax administration environment to improve the doing business competitiveness of Trinidad and Tobago and a platform for foreign investment. Once foreign investors know exactly what the rules are, they become more confident in terms of their willingness to invest in Trinidad and Tobago.
Honourable Minister, your time is up.
No problem.
Could the Honourable Minister of Finance indicate whether national domestic businesses, apart from foreign multinational corporations, are also involved in this transfer pricing scheme, which, as you said, robs the country of significant revenues? Or has it been brought to the minister's attention that national businesses in our country are involved in that kind of scheme as well?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. Any company that uses a foreign subsidiary or affiliated company to charge expenses which are then used to avoid taxation could be involved in transfer pricing. Let me just say that we expect to formalize this in the Parliament before the end of fiscal 2016. So we'll be coming here with legislation and regulations. But any company that has foreign affiliates who charge expenses on costs incurred outside of Trinidad and Tobago, whether it is a local company that has foreign affiliates or it's a multinational, any such company could be involved in transfer pricing.
Senator Mark.
Thank you. Question number 9 to the Honourable Minister of Finance.
As I said, Madam President, I don't want to say welcome back, Senator Mark, but all 6 questions are from Mark to me. Response to question number 9. Madam President, the matter concerning the exploration of affordable options for a mass transit system is currently before the Cabinet-appointed Standing Committee on Physical Infrastructure, chaired by the Honourable Prime Minister. This committee benefited recently from oral and visual presentations rendering a broad overview of the various options for mass transit systems. In fact, we were the beneficiaries of a presentation from an IDB team that was put together at short notice and visited Trinidad and Tobago a short while ago. The committee is awaiting a more detailed report of the IADB's analysis of our specific transport needs and circumstances. We expect to receive this report by the end of February 2016, arising from the previous visit. Answer to Part B. Given the response at Part A, if all goes according to plan and the project is deemed to be feasible, the investment decision for the mass transit project will be made by the end of September 2016. However, I wish to stress that no decision will be made without a process of thorough and meaningful public consultation.
Would the Honourable Minister wish to share with this House what were some of the options discussed as it relates to the mass transit system? What were some of the options that came to the attention of the infrastructural committees. Would you want to share some of those with us at this time?
Minister of Finance.
By all means. This is not IMF stuff. This is not confidential stuff. The IADB team looked at options of light rail, heavy rail, monorail, elevated railway systems, underground railway system, tramway systems, bus systems, looked at the experience of a number of countries in the Caribbean and Latin America in particular. There are a lot of experiences with respect to mass transit systems, most of which are railways. Quite a few are light railways, tramways, and so on. They looked at costs, they looked at the time for completion, they looked at the construction challenges, and they are examining an array of options for us, whether it is a tram system, a light rail system, an elevated system, maybe an underground system in certain areas. For example, there's always been a proposal that there should be an underground section between City Gate and Cocorite because of the traffic congestion in this area, that it might be preferable to have a short underground section, but of course cost will come into play. So they're looking at cost, they're looking at feasibility, they're looking at ridership, they're looking at the type of equipment and the speed of the vehicles and so on. So they're doing a comprehensive analysis of all possible mass transit systems available to Trinidad and Tobago in the context of the experiences of Latin America. And it is on that basis we will receive their recommendations at the end of February 2016.
Senator Mark.
Madam President, could the Honourable Minister indicate whether in the final analysis it is the intention of the government to maybe, once there is agreement, to access a loan finally from the IADB to underwrite whatever final option is decided upon? Is it the intention of the government to approach the IADB for a loan to underwrite this mass transit system, whichever option is finally agreed to?
President, the key word here is feasibility, acceptability, compatibility with our current infrastructure, our society, our transport needs. But yes, once everything goes according to plan, once the project is deemed to be cost effective, once that there's a good return on the investment, once it's not a burden on the Treasury, it is the plan to access a loan from the IDB at this point in time. Of course, other financing options are always on the table. There's no commitment to, we haven't signed any document with the IDB, but that's the plan. That they, having done the initial groundwork, they would have satisfied themselves at a preliminary pre-feasibility stage that the project is feasible, making it easier for the loan to be accelerated and executed quickly.
Senator Mark.
Finally, question number 10 to the Honourable Minister of Finance.
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Yes, Madam President, the senator is like a bad penny, showing up everywhere. Answer to question 10. Since the introduction of the value-added tax regime by the VAT Act of 1989, a number of amendments have been introduced over time, and we have moved away significantly from the original framework and original intent of this fiscal measure. These amendments have presented a range of administrative challenges and difficulties for the Board of Inland Revenue. It is now quite difficult to manage the VAT regime, especially in view of the high number of zero-rated and exempt items. It should be noted that the revenue collection from VAT has deteriorated over the last several years, and the system has become less efficient. For example, the actual collection of VAT declined from 6.6 billion in 2013 to 5.74 billion in 2014. And in most years over the period 2010 to 2015, the collection of VAT was overestimated. In order to make up the shortfall, the previous government utilized a number of mechanisms, including the mechanism of tax amnesties, which brought in additional revenue. However, while even this government as we move from one regime to another, may utilize the mechanism of a tax amnesty. This is not decided yet. This is not a sustainable method of increasing VAT collections, since if it is used too often, it will encourage taxpayers to avoid paying tax until it is absolutely necessary to do so. As a consequence, in order to minimize revenue leakage and to improve collection, the VAT system must be reformed. We are therefore in the process of identifying the items. In fact, we're almost finished. I was privy to a presentation just last week where we were finalizing the list of items, and we have more or less decided the items that would be now subject to VAT. We are therefore looking at the items that presently exist in the zero-rated and exempt categories and determining the range of essential, basic, luxury, and non-essential items so that appropriate adjustments can be made. I can tell you we're using the basket of goods that is used to calculate the retail price index as one of the indicators to determine whether an item is an essential item, a basic item, non-essential item, a luxury item. Answer to Part B. Apart from having the VAT regime as a revenue-raising measure, it is important that we continue the process of simplifying our tax laws to ensure a higher level of compliance. Generally, in the vast majority of countries, and Trinidad and Tobago is no exception, reductions in tax rates have generally resulted in increased collections through simplification and greater compliance. That is actually our own experience here in Trinidad and Tobago, when the taxation rates were reduced to 25% in the 2006 era. Tax collections over a period of years, instead of going down, in fact increased by 100% from 2006 to 2013, even though the rates went down to 25%. So we have our own experiences here of what happens when you simplify the system and you reduce the rate. We have actual experience of a 100% increase in collections.
Senator Mark.
The Honourable Minister indicated to this House whether he anticipates any inflationary pressures arising when the final list is issued on the 1st of January 2016, insofar as food inflation is concerned.
Honourable Minister, no. Senator Mark, that question is asking about anticipating something, and I don't think it really arises as well from what you had asked previously.
Motions relating to the business or sittings of the Senate and moved by a minister.
Leader of Government Business.
Madam President, I beg to move the following motion. Be it resolved that this Senate agree to the following appointments. 1. On the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee, that Mr. Wade Mark replace Mr. Roger Samuel. And 2. On the Public Accounts Committee, that Mr. Roger Samuel replace Mr. Wade Mark.
Honourable members, the question is on the Public Administration and Appropriations Committee that Mr. Wade Mark replace Mr. Roger Samuel, and on the Public Accounts Committee that Mr. Roger Samuel replace Mr. Wade Mark. Those in favour say aye. Those in favour say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it.
Public business, government business, motions.
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. I beg to move motion number 1, standing in my name. In moving this motion, I seek the leave of the Senate in accordance with Standing Order 48 to debate along with this matter motions number 2 and 3 on the order paper which relate to the same subject.
Is this the wish of the Senate?
No. May I advise, Madam President? We have held discussion with the leader of government business, and we made it very clear that we are prepared to jointly address motions number 1 and 2 together. And we will then debate External Loans Act, which is motion number 3, separately. We have so advised the leader of government business on the floor.
Honorable members, leave not having been granted, we will proceed with motions 1 and 2 together and deal with motion 3 separately. Honorable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Madam President. He or me? Thank you. Motion number 1. Whereas it is provided by Section 3 of the Development Loans Act that the government is authorized for the purpose of financing general development in Trinidad and Tobago, repayment of borrowings effected for such general development, or repayment of borrowings effected for general development by a statutory authority within the meaning of the Statutory Authorities Act, by an enterprise that is controlled by or on behalf of the state or by the University of the West Indies, to borrow from time to time, externally or internally, in a sum or sums not exceeding in the aggregate $30,000 million in the currency of Trinidad and Tobago. And whereas it is also provided in the said Section 3(1) that thereafter such sum and in such currency may from time to time be specified by resolution passed by the Senate and the House of Representatives, and whereas it is necessary for the government to borrow further sums of money for the purposes stated in the said section, be it resolved that for the purposes stated in the said section, the government is hereby authorized to borrow money externally or internally in a further sum or in further sums not exceeding in the aggregate $15,000 million in the currency of Trinidad and Tobago. Madam Speaker, may I also point, Madam President, sorry. Are you sure? Mr. Khan, what happened? Thank you. Thank you very much. Madam President, we had planned to do the 3 resolutions together. We will just do 1 and 2, and when we get to number 3, we will deal with that in the appropriate manner, since this is the wish of one member of the Senate, which is the procedure. Now, Madam President, the resolutions for the first 2 matters will increase the statutory borrowing limit under the Development Loans Act, Chapter 7104, from 30 billion to 45 billion, an increase of 15 billion. Will increase the statutory borrowing limit under the External Loans Act, Chapter 7105, from 15 billion to 30 billion, an increase of 15 billion. And as indicated, we will deal with the Guarantee of Loans Companies Act in due course. Am I correct, Madam President, that the 3rd resolution is the Guarantee of Loans Companies Act?
No.
It is not?
No, the second is. The third one is external.
No problem. It was in a different sequence in the other place. That is quite all right. I will deal with it appropriately. So, Madam President, we are going to deal at this time with the Development Loans Act, Chapter 7104, and the Guarantee of Loans Act, Companies, Chapter 7102. And we will handle the external loans at another time. Now, to put this matter into context, Madam President, on the achievement of independence in 1962, the modernization of the country became the responsibility of the government of Trinidad and Tobago. Through a range of policies anchored in 5-year development plans, the government began to lay down the foundation on which the citizens would strive for better lives. the socio-economic welfare of the population was central to economic plans and programs and 5-year development plans. At that time, the evidence indicated that the defining feature of growth and development was an investment-led rollout of infrastructure and the associated delivery of services. It was also understood at that time, and is still understood by most people, that the establishment of infrastructure should not be financed by current revenues. I'll give you an example. The last administration financed most of the cost of the Point Fortin highway from current revenues, which is contrary to classic economic thinking. It was also understood, Madam President, that long-term financing for infrastructure and related services was considered to be more appropriate, given the long-term usage of infrastructure, in particular through intergenerational usage. Successive generations paid for the use of infrastructure put down at one point in time. The experience of all advanced, emerging, and developing countries has borne out these conclusions. Development Loans Act, Chapter 7104. In 1964, in furtherance of this economic strategy, that you would want to have long-term financing for infrastructure, the Parliament put in place the Development Loans Act, Chapter 7104. The Act provides for the Minister of Finance to borrow domestically and externally through the issuance of bonds for the purpose of financing general development in Trinidad and Tobago. The initial limit set by the Act in 1964 was US 30 million, or 51 million at the then prevailing exchange rate of US $1 to TT $172. At today's exchange rate, the limit set in 64 would be almost $200 million. Subsequently, in the context of the need for resources while ensuring debt sustainability, the limit, that is the public sector debt relative to GDP, was reset in TT dollars as follows. In 1990, the limit under the Development Loans Act was increased to $5 billion. 1994, $7.5 billion. 1999, $10 billion. 2002, $13 billion. 2008, $20 billion. 2011, $30 billion. It was actually under the former administration in 2011 that the Development Loans Act limit was increased by $10 billion from $20 billion to $30 billion, along with other increases. Skip the External Loans Act and go to the Guarantee of Loans Companies Act. In the 1960s, the government began to assume a larger role in developing the economy by establishing public corporations which were assigned economic and commercial roles, particularly in areas where there were market failures, where the private sector, for example, was unwilling to intervene in light of the risk involved or the high capital requirements. The government also began to intervene where it considered the creation of a corporation was of strategic importance. The development of the Point Lisas estate with a modern petrochemical and steel complex was a classic example of an area where market failure caused the government to intervene. The establishment of the National Gas Company also met the strategic importance criteria. There were many other companies operating in the commercial and economic field, and like any company, they were required to raise financing on both the international and local markets. Without track records of performance, government guarantees were required for these fledgling companies. So that's the historical context, that in the late 1960s, the then Trinidad and Tobago government began to get more involved in developing the economy through the use of state corporations. And these corporations had no track record, and therefore a government guarantee was required in order to allow them to borrow money for their projects. The way the government dealt with this was to establish the Guarantee of Loans Companies Act, Chapter 7182. It provides for the guarantee by the government of loans by lending agencies to companies in which the government holds at least 50% of the ordinary share capital. The Act prescribes a limit on the value of guarantees for borrowing by wholly and majority-owned state enterprises. Section 3 of the Act states that the government may guarantee the discharge by a company of its obligations under any agreement which may be entered into by the company with a lending agency in respect of any borrowing by that company that is authorized by the government. Since the enactment of the Act in 1969, there have been several revisions of the limits. 1970, the limit was raised to $70 million. 1972, $120 million. 1974, $200 million. 1976, $400 million. 1978, $1 billion. 1979, $5 billion. 2002, $9 billion. And in 2011, the former administration increased the limit under the Guarantee of Loans Companies Act by, I'm afraid I'll have to use this word, by a whopping $16 billion, from $9 billion to $25 billion. So that's an increase of $10 billion under the Development Loans Act under the former administration, and an increase of $16 billion under the Guarantee of Loans Act, total of $26 billion, increase in the limit by the former administration in 2011. That's why I'm a bit surprised at some of the comments made by opposition spokesmen, as if this is something new. This has never been done before. They didn't do it. They don't know anything about it, and they don't understand what it is for. I'm a bit surprised at their amnesia, Madam President. So there's a fourth act that has no limit, and this was, to borrow a word from the Honorable Senator Mark, secretly used by the former administration to borrow. The fourth piece of legislation is the Guarantee of Loans Statutory Act, Chapter 7181. It provides for the guarantee by the government of loans by lending agencies to statutory authorities as opposed to companies for public purposes. An example is the airport modernization, port development, water production and transmission, electricity transmission, housing development by the HDC, public transportation by the PTSC, and carnival activities by the National Carnival Commission. This act does not prescribe a limit, and as of November 2015, the outstanding guarantee loans under this piece of legislation stood at $11 billion. And may I say, this $11 billion did not include any loans entered into by the present government. The total limits and the available headroom under the legislation is as follows. Under the Development Loans Act, Chapter 7104, despite, as I have pointed out, an increase in the limit under that act of $10 billion from $20 billion to $30 billion by the former administration in 2011, there's only $200 million left. So they used up $9.8 billion of the $10 billion increase in the limit between 2011 and September the 6th, 2015. Under the Guarantee of Loans Companies Act, there's only $2.6 billion of headroom left. So they used up $13.4 billion of the $16 billion of headroom created by them in 2011. So they increased the limit for the Guarantee of Loans Companies Act by $16 billion in 2011, and they've used up $13.4 billion of that $16 billion. And of the $10 billion increase in development loans, they've used up $9.8 billion of that headroom. And so, Madam President, what faces the present administration? We have virtually no headroom in the loan ceilings. We have a number of liabilities that we've been saddled with by the previous administration, and I will give some details in a short while. If you could just tell me, Madam President, how much more time do I have?
And my apologies, you have about 20 minutes left.
There's no need to apologize, Madam President. Thank you very much for that. So, the previous administration came to the Parliament in 2011, increased our debt ceilings by $32 billion, and that included $16 billion under the guarantee of loans, $10 billion under the development loans, and the remaining $6 billion, $8 billion, if my maths are correct. We'll deal with that when we come to the External Loans Act, the remainder under the External Loans Act. So, as I said, where does that take us today? Let me just read into the record some of the matters that we have been saddled with, where loan agreements for contracts already executed by the former administration cannot be signed. Because if I were to sign them, I would be breaking the law. I would be, in fact, executing a loan contract that would be unlawful under the various borrowing acts. So I cannot sign them. And some of these projects are very important. I see the Honorable Senator Samuel looking at me, because one of them refers to that Honorable Senator. And that is the construction of the Rima Hospital, which has a project value of $1.85 billion. Let me repeat that. The Rima Hospital. There are a number of projects. Madam President, could you ask Honorable Senators opposite to allow me to speak in peace? Thank you very much. I know it upsets them, but I'd like them to let me speak in peace. A construction of a Rima Hospital, project value $1.85 billion. The lender was the Export-Import Bank of China. The decision was made by Cabinet in February 2013, and a commercial contract was executed on December 31st, 2014 between UDCOT and China Railway Construction for TT $1.3 billion. The other amounts, the other $600 million of work is being done by others, and that's another matter that we are investigating. These projects are quite unusual, where you have a construction cost of $1.2 billion, but a project cost of $1.8 billion, so that the soft costs, and Senator Mahabir will know what I mean when I say soft costs. So the hard costs, the construction costs of the Rima Hospital, $1.2 billion. The other costs, which is consultants' fees and so on, $600 million. The Cuba Hospital is the same thing. So whereas the international benchmark for soft costs, consultants' fees and so on, is in the range of, say, 15% for a project of this nature, we have a new phenomenon in Trinidad and Tobago, where the former administration entered into contracts, these huge projects, billions of dollars, where the soft cost component is 50%. I think this is worthy of a place in the Guinness World Book of Records, that you would have construction costs $1.2 billion, other costs $600 million. And the Cuba Hospital, same thing. Construction costs $1 billion, other costs $500 million. So anyway, the fact of the matter is that this loan arrangement could not be signed because the headroom was just not available. So what the former administration did is give the contractor a partial payment of mobilization, 10% I believe, and just leave it. And then the election came, the government changed. So I am now, as Minister of Finance, I have to deal with this. So I am now faced with a contractor on site, working, sending letters to the Ministry of Finance and to the Ministry of Health for payment, and no payment arrangements in place because the limits, the headroom on the various legislation is exhausted. And that's just one. Another one, acquisition of the Chinese hull for the Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard. Cost $230 million. Commercial contract, July 4th, 2015, just a couple of months before the election, between the government of Trinidad and Tobago and China Shipbuilding Trading. No loan arrangements in place. That's another $230 million, which cannot be completed without dealing with the matter before the House today. That's just two projects. Let me give you another one. Construction of Point Fortin Hospital, $1.6 billion. You'll hear the numbers, Madam President. Arima Hospital, 1.8. Point Fortin Hospital, 1.6. Hoover Hospital, 1.5. It's not millions are talking about, it's billions are talking about. So the three of them, in excess of $5 billion for just 3 projects. And what is the fact with the Point Fortin Hospital? Commercial contract executed on December 23rd, 2014. Loan arrangement currently stalled. That's what my note tells me. Process currently stalled. Awaiting all of the legal documentation and the execution of the loan agreement. Export credit facility for the acquisition. So that is 1.8, 230, 1.5. So that takes us to about $3.4 billion already with those 3 projects. Then we have the construction of the Hoover Children's Hospital, $1.5 billion. That agreement was signed, which is what has pushed up the borrowing to almost to the limit. Export credit facility for the acquisition of naval assets, $1.377 billion, Madam President. 12 shipbuilding contracts signed in April 2015, again, just a few months before the election, between the Ministry of National Security and DAMEN. Status of loan, currently being negotiated, awaiting approval of increase in fee cap, conditions precedent, and of course, awaiting approval for what we're about today. Commercial credit facility for the acquisition of naval assets. This is more money again for more naval vessels, $200 million. And loan agreement between the government and Answer Merchant Bank executed September 7, 2015. So that's yet another one. Then we have all these projects here. Endeavor Business and Infrastructure Park, US $93,600 million Trinidad and Tobago dollars. Commercial contract executed on February 19, 2015 between ETEC and China Harbor Engineering. Deferred. Can't sign the loan agreement. Contract signed. Can't sign the loan agreement. Transshipment and dry dock project, US $499 million, $3 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars. Contract executed February 11, 2014 between the Ministry of Trade and China Harbor Engineering. Status of loan arrangement, deferred. Can't sign it. Development of 6 new industrial parks, US $150 million, $1 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars. Contract executed on February 15, 2014. Status of loan, deferred. Acquisition of 3 unmanned aerial vehicles, deferred. TT 100 million. Acquisition of 4 light twin helicopters and 1 medium twin helicopter, US $81 million, $500 million Trinidad and Tobago dollars. Executed on March 3rd, 2015, between National Operations Center and Bell Helicopters. 500 million, status of loan, deferred. And you know, oh, thank you so much. There was a little error. That's so nice to know. So, Madam President, the former administration, unless they were all comatose when they were signing these contracts, and each one has a cabinet minute associated with it. I'll give you an example, the Endeavor Business Park, cabinet minute number 3157 of 2013, the transshipment project, cabinet minute 231 of 2014, the 6 new industrial parks, cabinet minute number 2758 of September 2013, the naval assets for the Trinidad and Tobago Coast Guard, various cabinet minutes of 2014, the hospitals that I spoke about, the Arima Hospital, cabinet minute 442 of 2013, the Chinese Hull, cabinet minute of December 2014, the Point Fortin Hospital, cabinet minute 2012 255 of 2014. So unless they were all comatose in cabinet, they cannot now come and tell us that they are not aware that they entered into these projects. You add it up, you get $11 billion, honorable senators. $11 billion in contracts where the loan arrangements cannot be signed. And yet the former Prime Minister, the now leader of the opposition, is asking, what is this for? And Senator Mahabir, you will have to excuse me when I get a question like that. I get kind of tizzic because when I look into the records, $11 billion in contracts executed with international agencies, with foreign governments. $11 billion in contracts, no loan arrangements in place, can't sign the loans, and there are penalties. This is the treasonous nature, and I have to use the word treasonous. It's tantamount to treason when a government signs contracts that it knows it can't borrow the money for, and it knows it doesn't have the cash for, because the central bank overdraft is running at $9 billion, and this has been going on for 12 months. This is what I'm told, that the cash balances in the central bank close up to the $9 billion limit for all of 2015 and into 2040. They take out all the money from the NGC, running a deficit, so you can't use your current revenues to finance these projects. You enter into these arrangements, $11 billion in contracts. You can't sign the loan agreements because the headroom on the various bits of legislation is exhausted. And you hand that to the incoming government and say, take that and deal with that. And then when the incoming government comes in to make sure that we don't break the law, because we're paying $8,000 a day for just one of these contracts because we have not signed the loan agreement. The government can't sign the loan agreements because it will bust the borrowing limit. We're paying $8,000 a day in penalties, 50,000 Trinidad and Tobago dollars a day on one of these contracts.
Shame.
That is the gift that has been handed to this new administration. Then we come here, the former Prime Minister says, it's dangerous, what you're doing that for? Well, what would they want us to do? Walk away? Stop the ARIMA? Where's Samuel gone? Senator Samuel. Stop the ARIMA hospital? Stop the Point Fortin hospital? Stop the renege on the payments for the Cuba hospital? Send back the boats to Holland, the Yemen vessel? Send back the Chinese vessel? That's what they want us to do? Become international pariahs in the international community? Renege on all our contractual arrangements and refuse to enter into loan agreements? That is what they want us to do? Madam President, sometimes I am astonished at what I hear, the rhetoric I hear from the other side. And I'm just giving one example. The Honorable Minister of Housing in the other place last week gave another example. Read out $10 billion in contracts executed at the Housing Development Corporation. $10 billion. A contract up in Arima, in the Chestrail Farm area, $1.4 billion for 1,000 houses or thereabouts. A contract by Indian Trail, $1.6 billion for another 800 or 900 houses. A multitude of other contracts all over the country. When you do the maths, you get $10 billion in unfinanced projects entered into by the former administration at the Housing Development Corporation. Contractors on site, no money, no loan arrangements, unfinanced. That is now 11 plus 10, $21 billion in unfinanced projects that we have been handed to as a gift by the former administration. And when we come to this honorable place to increase the limit, they say dangerous. We mustn't do it. You know, it is very, very difficult to deal with members opposite Madam President. Very, very difficult because they don't live in Trinidad and Tobago. It is obvious. They don't live here. I mean, when one looks at what happened, and we have no choice in order to get our infrastructure programs going and in order to develop the productive sector, in order to open up areas of the country so as to stimulate economic activity, to open up rural areas such as northeast Trinidad. That is what the purpose of the first-class road to Toco is, and the construction of the port in Toco. That's what that is all about. To build a first-class road to Maruga and to build a fishing port in Maruga, all of that is geared towards opening up the country for economic development. To build a ring road around Chaguanas. I don't know how many honorable senators reside in or around the Chaguanas area, but the traffic in Chaguanas is horrendous. You try to get from one side of the road to the other side, from one side of the highway to the other side. You better be prepared to wait an hour in some situations just to travel 100 feet to go from the PriceSmart side to the Felicity side. You better be prepared sometimes to wait for an hour to pass through that traffic. So we must build a ring road around Chaguanas. How are we going to build this road if the cash balances in the central bank have been exhausted, if the dividends in NGC have been exhausted, if we have a collapse in commodity prices so that we're not getting the current revenues that we need at this point in time, and the borrowing limits have been exhausted? How? Wave a magic wand? So that I would expect that from the members of the opposition, we would get a reality check, Madam President, instead of rhetoric. Let me also look at the deficits that the former administration entered into. In 2011, a deficit of $4 billion. Budget deficit. 2012, a budget deficit of $3.5 billion. 2013, a budget deficit of $5.2 billion. 2014, a budget deficit of $4.9 billion. 2015, a budget deficit of $7 billion. And if you take half of 2010, that's another $1.4 billion. $27 billion in accumulated deficits over the tenure of the last administration. And, you know, I heard members of the other side in another place saying, oh, we had systems in place to deal with the 2015 deficit. We would have got money from the Phoenix Park IPO. We'd have got money from the TGU. It makes you wonder, what world are they living in? If the Phoenix Park IPO had come in before the end of the fiscal, if the TGU money had come in before the end of the fiscal, and it couldn't, because as usual, just like all of these projects here, they didn't do their homework, they didn't put the arrangements in place, so it couldn't be done. There's a lot of legal paperwork. You have to get an opinion from the Attorney General in these matters to make sure that everything is in conformity with our laws. You have to sign a number of guarantees and so on. They did none of that. But they expect a magic wand to be waved and money just flowing from the IPO and the TGU repayment of past borrowing. Just flows. You just do so whoosh and money just comes. That's not how you run a country. You have to do the paperwork. But anyway, even if by some magic those inflows had come in before September 30th, all that would have done is transfer the problem into 2016. It's the same basket of funds. I'm sure that Senator Mahabir knows what I'm talking about. So if the IPO money had come in fiscal 2015, all that would do is make it not available in fiscal 2016. Simple. But you wonder when you hear honorable members opposite, oh, they could have reduced the deficit in 2015 from 7 billion down to 5 billion or whatever, because the IPO money would have dealt with that. Oh, no problem. Then you just have a bigger deficit in 2016, because the metrics are the same. The revenues from oil, the revenues from corporation tax, the revenues from income tax, the metrics are the same. So whether the cash came in just before the end of September or it came in October, it makes no difference. And therefore, Madam President, I am coming to this Parliament, we are coming, the government of Trinidad and Tobago is coming to this Parliament today to seek an increase in borrowing limits. This is, as I said, this is nothing new. This has been done time and time again. It's been done since the 1960s. And when you look at the debt to GDP ratio, because we are going to be fiscally prudent, when you look at the actual figures, in 1991, the country's debt to GDP ratio was 70%. Remember, the NAR had taken the country into the hands of the IMF in the 1986 to 1991 period because of the collapse in commodity prices. Things weren't good in that period, from 86 to 91. Things were bad because oil prices had collapsed from $40 down to $9. Between 1980 and 1986, it went from 40 to 9. So things were not good. There was a change of government, and the NER government took the country into the IMF. And coming out of that IMF, those standby, back-to-back standby arrangements, the debt-to-GDP ratio in 1991 going into 1992, when the PNM came in 1992, the debt-to-GDP ratio was 70%. The PNM managed to bring that down to 62% by 1995. By 2000, with stabilization of commodity prices, increases in oil prices, the debt-to-GDP ratio stood at 51%. And during the era of the previous PNM administration, between 2001 and 2010, the debt-to-GDP ratio dropped to 32%, from 51 when we came in 2001 to 32% in 2010 when we demitted office on the last occasion. And in the middle there, when commodity prices were really high in 2007 and so on, we managed to get our debt-to-GDP ratio down to below 20%. But it crept back up to 32%, but again with the collapse in commodity prices in the 2008 period. So that what happened over the last 5 years, the debt-to-GDP went back up from 32%, which is where it was left in 2010, to 46% in 2015, Madam President. Now, when you look around the world, when you look at the situation in the European Union, Madam President, when you look at, you can't use the United States as a good example. The United States has the world's favorite currency, the US dollar. They have trillions of dollars in debt. The debt-to-GDP ratio is phenomenal. They always running out of cash. They always have a fiscal cliff and a clash between Congress, Senate, and the President, and tension. They stop paying public servants sometimes for a little while, and then they get over it and they move along. So the United States is not a good example of debt-to-GDP ratio and so on. But because they're the world's favorite currency, they solve it by just printing more US dollars. That's all they do. We can't do that in Trinidad and Tobago. We can't print more Trinidad and Tobago dollars. We have to make sure our assets match our currency in circulation. So we have to look around the world and look for some good benchmark. We can't use the United States, as I said. We can't use Japan, where they have debt-to-GDP ratios of 100% and so on. We can't use those countries. So that we have to look around the world and look for a good benchmark. And we have looked to the European Union and looked to the countries in the European Union in terms of what is a desirable debt-to-GDP ratio as we get out of this situation that we're in right now. Now, Madam President, when you're calculating the debt-to-GDP ratio, you have to use the GDP at market prices. Because when the economists look at the economy, they use something called constant prices. So when you're talking about growth in GDP, you have to relate it to a particular era. And we use 2000 as our benchmark year to look at the growth in GDP year on year. You reference it to a benchmark, the year 2000, and then you look at your GDP constant prices. So if, in fact, we are to examine, which we are doing, what is the GDP of Trinidad and Tobago at constant prices, we will use the 2000 benchmark to do that. And in reference to something we spoke about a little while ago, this is what the CSO will be looking at. Use the established benchmark, constant prices 2000, and look at the change in GDP in 2015 to see, in fact, whether it has remained flat, whether it has decreased slightly, or whether it has increased slightly. And I wish to repeat that in October, the CSO was telling us that based on their calculations, there would be a 1% growth in the economy in 2015. And the central bank was saying quite the opposite, that there'd be a 1% decline in GDP. But the point is that when you're looking at your debt to GDP ratio, you have to look at the market prices. So our current GDP, our market GDP at this time is about $170 billion, more or less. And we expect that by the year 2019, looking at the growth in GDP over the last 20 years, that the GDP in 2019, well, in 2016, we expect it to go to about 173. This is not at constant prices, I must stress. This is at market prices. 2017, 182. 2018, 191. 2019, $200 billion at market prices at that point in time. So that when you look at the borrowing limit of $120 billion, which would occur once this Honorable House approves the matters before it, you would be looking at a debt to GDP ratio of somewhere in 2019 of about 60%. And if we achieve the limits, which we won't, in 2017, 2018, because these things take time to get going, you will be looking at theoretical debt to GDP ratios of 65%, 63%, and so on. But there's no way we can burn up $50 billion in 2 years. That's not impossible. We are not the UNC. They could do that. One thing they could do is spend.
What?
They could spend.
For sure.
They could spend money.
For sure.
But we in the PNM, we do things in a structured manner. We just spoke about the mass transit system.
Minister, you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you very much. And I'm almost finished. We do things in a structured manner. We've gone to the IDB. They're doing the pre-feasibility for us. Then we make an investment decision at the end of 2016. And then you start to do your invitation of tenders and so on. Your award a contract maybe at the end of 2017. And it starts to kick in 2018. That's the mass transit system. We're not like them. We don't go and sign contract today and order the goods tomorrow. We don't order naval vessels from Holland without signing a contract. I don't know if senators opposite know that's what happened. The boats arrive on credit, no loan agreement, no nothing. They came on trust. We don't do that. So we are looking at a debt to GDP ratio at the maximum of maybe in the vicinity of about 60% if we are able to do our programs over the next 5 years. And the average debt to GDP ratio in many of the developed countries is about 65%. So we don't consider that this is extreme, and Trinidad and Tobago has had debt to GDP ratios of higher than that on many, many occasions. This country has had the resilience to manage this, and we do not see this as difficult. It has been done on many occasions before, and we expect, as we diversify our economy, that we would be able to manage a debt to GDP ratio of 60% if this becomes necessary. But there is no other way we can develop this country. As I indicated, the cash balances at the central bank have been exhausted, and you know, it's really not the right way to run a country. You don't do your projects cash. Who does that? Only billionaires write a check from their current account when they're going to buy a new mansion. Only billionaires do that. But other people, normal people, will go to the bank and take out a loan. That's what countries do. Normal countries, when they have to do things, when they have to build a highway costing $8 billion, they don't build it cash. They go and they negotiate a loan with a multilateral agency, get a moratorium on payments, get low interest rates, get it spread over 20 years. That's what normal countries do. But what this former administration did, they took $16 billion in cash out of the central bank and used it for their projects. They took $14 billion out of the National Gas Corporation in dividends and used it for their projects. We don't intend to be so fiscally irresponsible, Madam President. And that is why we are here. And I am ready to answer any question posed to me by honorable members opposite. I'm particularly interested in what the independents would have to say, because I am certain it will not have any rhetoric in it. I'm sure that what the independents will tell me would be cogent and purposeful. And I'm willing and ready to answer any question. And I beg the approval of this Senate with respect to these two motions. I beg to move, Madam President.
Honourable members, I shall now propose the question for debate. Be it resolved that for the purposes stated in the said section, the government is hereby authorized to borrow money externally or internally in a further sum or in further sums not exceeding in the aggregate $15,000 million in the currency of Trinidad and Tobago. Members are reminded that leave has been granted to speak on motion 2 as well.
Thank you very much. Madam President, I'm very happy to join this debate on two very important motions before this Honorable Senate. Madam President, the grim reality facing our economy has not really been properly addressed by the Honourable Minister, who has come to this Senate seeking an increase in the loan ceiling amounting to $35 billion. And what we get from the Honourable Minister is old talk, cheap talk, cheap talk. And the hard and harsh reality facing our country. This is the second time he has run away whenever we get up to speak. Disrespectful and contemptuous, not only of our standing orders, but the House itself. But,
Senator Mark, yes.
sorry.
Yes, let us not comment on other members, please.
I'll refer to the standing orders. Okay, no problem. No problem. No problem. No problem. So, Madam President, Trinidad and Tobago under the PNM, after 3 months almost, is in a state of what you can call economic standstillism. This is what you call a NATO government. No action, talk only. That is all they are about. 600 workers laid off yesterday. Workers are losing their jobs all over the country every day. And all we get from this government is old talk. You come for new money. $35 billion. But you did not bring a plan along to convince this Senate and the population that you know what you are about. Madam President, what is the grim reality facing Trinidad and Tobago today? Whether he likes the governor or he hates the governor of the central bank, that is his business. I will bring it up in the next debate, a little more to deal with that matter. There's a recession, he says there is no recession. An engineer is telling an economist who is the central bank governor, no recession. Yeah, he's saying it on facts. He could not consult with the Central Statistical Office. But there are 4 quarters of negative economic growth in our economy so far. There are 4 quarters of negative economic growth in this economy thus far. But you say that there's no recession. The economy is in a state of contraction.
Since when?
I'm not speaking to you now. The country external position is coming under more and more pressure in this country. The central bank, the central government, Madam President, fiscal position is worsening. We are told that the fiscal deficit is going to be 3 billion. Reality tells us it could be between 8 and 10 at the end of fiscal 2016. Not to mention the public debt, which is on the rise. And you come here and telling this country and this Senate, you want $35 billion more to develop this economy. But you offer no plans, you offer no strategy, you have no program, and you are visionless, as you are clueless, as you are hopeless. This is a hopeless government, directionless. The country is going nowhere fast under this administration, nowhere fast. And you come here with old talk, fighting the governor when you should be growing the economy. That's what you're doing. Madam President, you know what the people are asking? I'll tell you what the people are asking and what he is not addressing. The people are saying, what are your plans? They are concerned about this economy. What are your programs on which these loans of $35 billion will be spent? Not a word, just old talk. Ring road around Sagonas, something in Toko. That's how you deal with the country? When you're coming for $35 billion? Where is your economic plan? Where is your economic strategy? Where is your fiscal strategy? There is nothing before us. And you are in office almost 3 months. And Madam President, the key question is not what you're going to borrow. The key question that people are asking is how is the government going to repay what they are going to borrow? We have gotten no answer from the Honorable Minister. All he does is to spend his time going back into the past, back in times. He like back in times music. People are going forward ever, he's going backward ever. That is why you are in power, Madam President. People want you to do their work. Madam President, what are the plans and programs on which the loans will be spent? We need to know, Madam President. That was not made clear by the Minister of Finance. He spent time focusing on money utilized by the previous administration. But he didn't tell us what are his plans to deal with these new funds that he wants approved today. Madam President, we ask the question, is these or are these monies going to be spent on vanity projects, such as the so-called rapid rail? Or are we going to get what the Prime Minister then promised during the campaign, a plyboard factory? That was his vision of growth and innovation and transformation and development, a plywood factory. Madam President, we want the minister to tell us and to provide us with a list of projects and the cost of those projects under the respective heads as it relates to these motions. We want to know what you are going to spend the money on. But we are not getting this. Where is the plan? How are they going to repay these loans? 65, 50 billion all told, 35 in these two motions, Madam President. But this comes at a time when there are falling prices in terms of oil, in terms of gas, in terms of petrochemicals, in terms of other commodities in the country and in the global economy. But you're coming to borrow. But you're not telling us how you're going to repay. Madam President, what we are asking for is not rocket science, you know. Senator Henry, who is here, oh, he disappeared. He was here a short while ago. When he spoke on Friday, September the 9th, 2011, he asked the question, and I raise it here, Madam President. One of here, and I quote him at 11:45 a.m. One of the main problems with this extension of the government spending limit, that was the Honorable Winston Ducran at the time, is that it is coming at a time, of course, when we are not seeing very bright prospects for revenue generation and for real economic growth. This is what Senator Henry was saying back in 2011. Where was the revenue going to come from? Where was the economic growth going to come from? But it came for support. He said we have no problem necessarily with the idea of increasing borrowing. What are you borrowing for? That is the question that we're asking, that he has asked. Then, and how is this borrowing going to be repaid, Madam President? What kind of programs have you generated that would ensure us that enough growth will happen so that we'll be able to repay this money down the road? That is what Senator Henry told the Senate in September of 2011. And what about what the former minister, the member who is now Minister of Finance, when he was in another incarnation, what did he say? What did he ask when a same attempt was made to raise the ceiling, Madam President? Hear what he asked. That is the Honorable Minister of Finance on September the 7th, 2011, and I quote, "We want to know what you are going to spend that $16 billion on." That was on the motion dealing with the guarantees of company loans. That $16 billion is effectively mortgaging the future of this country's children, because it is the children of the future who have to pay back that $16 billion which they intend to borrow for state enterprise projects. That is what the then member, now Minister of Finance, was asking, Madam President. He goes on, what does this government want us to agree to allow them to borrow $16 billion to do? There is no way I could agree to a $16 billion increase in our ceiling with that threadbare presentation coming from the Minister of Finance, with no indication whatsoever on what you are going to spend the money on. So, Madam President, here it is. We are asking the very question that the honorable member, who is now Minister of Finance, was asking in 2011. You are coming to ask for monies, $35 billion, but you offer us no perspective, no plans, no programs as to how this money is going to be spent, Madam President. And Madam President, I want to tell you that the country and the people are worried. The ordinary people are concerned as to where this economy is going. They want to know where this economy is going and where the PNM is taking this economy. Madam President, you would know, and any member of this honorable House would know, that in any part of the world, before one approaches a bank or a credit union or any lender to borrow money, one should know how much one wants to borrow. In addition, Madam President, you need to know the purpose of the loan. What is the purpose of the loan one is seeking? And what is the possible impact of these loans on the overall finances? Nobody is going to lend you money, Madam President, without you having that capacity to repay. So we are asking the question, why is the government seeking to put the cart before the horse? I am convinced that this government does not have a vision, does not have a plan, they have no purpose in terms of the road forward. They are literally governing by VAPs. They are borrowing by VAPs, Madam President. It is indefensible. It is reckless. And it is bordering on lunacy for a government to come to this parliament and seek our approval for $35 billion, and they have no plans. They have no programs, no projects, and they want us to sign a blank check for them to have a good time at the expense of the nation.
Tell us your plan.
No, you are in government. That is why you are there. You must tell me your plan for the country. That is what you must tell me. You want me to tell you our plan? Why you must tell you our plan? You resign first, and we will come across there and take your place. And then we will tell you our plan. You can't govern the country? Leave. You can't govern? Go. That is what you have to do. And then we will tell you what our plans are. That is what you want to... You understand, Madam President? Yes. So, Madam President, what are some of the economic issues I want to draw to your attention today, and this House's attention? Rising debt, GDP ratio. We are told by the Honorable Minister, 46% now. Where it will be later, he says nothing. So we have to look at the possibility, Madam President, of the rising GDP, debt to GDP ratio, with this approval this evening here. We have to look, Madam President, in the absence of no plans and programs and projects, to the possibility of a downgrading of this country's credit rating. We understand that the Standards and Poor's supposed to be visiting here within the next 2 weeks. That is what we understand. Unless you tell them don't come. If you tell them don't come, they won't come. As long as you invited the IMF to come, they came. So if you tell them don't come, no problem. So, Madam President, we have to look at the possibility of a downgrading of the country's credit ratings. We have to look at the possibility of rising inflationary pressures on our country. We have to look at the possible increases in lending rates already. You know what is the prime lending rate, I understand, Madam President? Close to 8.75%, close to 9% already in Trinidad and Tobago. There's also a possible pressure on systemic liquidity. And of course, Madam President, there's also the rising cost of living for the poor and the vulnerable in our country that we must protect at all costs. The government has to pay attention to poverty and the rise in poverty if they continue to stand still and do nothing. This government reminds me like of a street light or a light pole, a street sign. All they do is they stand, they give it like, they're not going anywhere, you know, but they're pointing. They're talking, but they're not acting. They're not doing anything. All talk. We have to be conscious, Madam President, that if we do not manage our economy properly, there will be a rise in criminality and violence in our country. Already the government has indicated wage freeze and salary freeze is going to be the order of the day in this country. They have started at NGC, and I can predict today that this government is going across the board with a general wage freeze and salary freeze in this country. Not to mention rising job losses. You have seen it has already begun. Madam President. Madam President, when you want to deal with these loans, like for guarantees for state enterprises, we need to find out from the government exactly which state enterprises it is going to be supporting, right? Which state enterprises? Where's the money going, Madam President, in that regard? These are matters and so on that the people would like to know. Madam President, it has been said that money should always be spent to create wealth and not consume wealth. You must create wealth and not consume wealth. And therefore, decisions that we make today may either help us or hurt us tomorrow. And that is why we are concerned about this $35 billion that you want to spend, that we believe you want to spend on vanity projects. Is it the fact that you want to build a hotel in St. Clair? I'm not too sure. Let us know. Are you moving agriculture to Chaguanas in order to make way for some financier of the PNM to build a hotel in St. Clair? Let us know. Are we going to finance real socio-economic development that would benefit our people? How are we going to allocate resources to facilitate a reduction in crime and a creation of jobs in our country? We didn't get that from the Honorable Minister. There are no mileposts that have been established, Madam President, to tell us within 20 months, within 2 years, if we borrow a certain portion of this money, the country will be at X stage or Y stage. We have nothing because the government is bankrupt. They have nothing. I understand, Madam President, all this government is doing is paying salaries and wages. No projects. And everything is under review. Highway to Point Forte, under review. Everything is at a standstill. And all this Minister of Finance is doing is fighting with the governor. Fighting. And I want to know why you're fighting with him. I could tell you why just now. I'll tell you why. I have all the facts on that, you know. I'll tell you why. And you must tell us if you have two governors, former governors, in your office, housed in your office, Uric Bob, and a fellow called Ewart Williams. I want to know, you must tell this parliament and this country if you have two advisors in the Ministry of Finance today who are former governors of the central bank. Just tell us that. No, that's what I want you to tell me. Dukaran? I want to know if Uric Bob is the advisor. Huh? Yeah. So, Madam President, since the PNM has come to power, dark clouds have emerged on the horizon. Deaths, murderous deaths. People are being murdered, and when they are not being murdered, they are being killed on the roads. So we're going from murders and deaths to greater economic and financial debt. That is where the PNM wants to take us. Madam President, you know, the Honorable Minister of Finance did not tell us, did not tell this Parliament, how we arrived at this magical number of $50 billion. He has not told the Senate why $50 billion. What was the rationale for $50 billion? Or in the case of these two motions, we have $35 billion. What was the rationale for it? Why could that have been 70 or 20 or 15? We got no explanation. You know, this $50 billion represents some 79% of the 2016 budget, the largest in the history of this country. This huge borrowing, Madam President, is going to place on the next generation a severe debt burden. And therefore, the question that must be asked, how does the government intend to relieve the next generation of this tremendous burden? Would we be spending in building productive capacity?
Most definitely.
Where is the evidence? That old talk? Where are the facts? Where are the projects? Where are the plans? Nothing before this Honorable House. Would the government be taking the opportunity to build the human capacity and talent and skill of our people? Madam President, that would allow us to generate future streams of income? Or is it designed to promote, Madam President, wasteful consumption? How will this additional borrowing affect the country's debt to GDP ratio, which is currently at 46.5%? With this irresponsible, huge and reckless borrowing spree, the debt to GDP ratio is expected to increase close to 2/3 of our GDP, which could be between 67% and 70%. after they spend the $50 billion, $50 billion, and they are going to spend it, you know. In spite of what the Minister of Finance is saying, they are going to spend every cent of that $50 billion, Madam President. Borrowing more whilst earning less revenue, Madam President, owing to the precipitous decline in energy prices, is a recipe for economic disaster.
Senator Mark,
Madam?
you have 10 more minutes.
A recipe, thank you, Madam President, a recipe for economic disaster. So, Madam President, people are concerned. Workers are concerned. Households are concerned. They are worried as to where this economy is heading. And all we see is vindictiveness, viciousness, and no attempt on the part of the administration to pull this economy together. So, Madam President, we know that in these times, we have to manage very, very prudently our scarce financial resources. We have to. And one of the areas that we want to address is to ensure that within a very short period of time, the government takes the necessary steps to put and to operationalize procurement legislation. Because a lot of these projects that we don't know about, that will come about without our knowledge today, if we do not have proper procurement legislation in place. The corruption that they talk about and they accuse the PP about, they are going to be swimming and drowning in corruption shortly. You have to bring procurement legislation, and you have to operationalize procurement legislation, Madam President, if we are to avoid the scourge of grand-scale corruption, which the PNM is noted for. In fact, the PNM, as we know, is the father of corruption. The father, the grandfather, the grandmother, everyone. We have that today? that you're... Okay. Madam President, I would like very much to put an amendment to the two motions that are before us. I would like, Madam President, to move the following amendment to motions number 1 and 2, standing, and this amendment is being moved, and it reads as follows: and be it further resolved that for the sake of protection of the public interest, that no new procurement to be facilitated by borrowings made possible by this resolution be effected until a new, more transparent procurement law is fully in effect, Madam President. So I am moving this amendment so that it can be added to the motion 1 and 2 that is currently before this Honorable House, Madam President. We would want to have that considered, And before I take my seat, Madam President, do I ask somebody to second it?
Madam President, I stand to second, and I want to reserve my time to speak. Thank you.
The amendment to the motion has been seconded by Senator Amin. So let me propose the amendment. Honorable Senators, the question is that the motion be amended as follows. And be it further resolved that for the sake of protection of the public interest, that no new procurement be facilitated by borrowings made possible by this resolution be effected until a new, more transparent procurement law is fully in effect. Honorable Senators, the question is that the motion be amended, and Senators taking part in the debate hereafter may now speak on the original motion and the proposed amendment.
Madam President, so I want to rush to the conclusion.
Senator Mark, having had the amendment seconded, I think your contribution is now at an end. I've put the amended motion.
Thank you very much.
Madam President, just on a point of clarification, does the amendment have to be put to the vote now?
No.
Okay.
The proposed motion has been seconded. I've read it now, and senators who are now joining the debate can speak on the original and the amended. Creese.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, my contribution today would have as its basic premise that the recommendations that I am making assume that the central government and the relevant ministries would be involved in policy formulation, project identification and facilitation, project monitoring, while the municipal bodies will be responsible for project execution, and that they will be doing so through their regional coordinating committees. I say this, Madam President, because I am concerned of the tendency within our system for the delineation of functions between the two arms of government to be continuously obscured. What does this have to do with the question of borrowing? Because at the end of the day, if we do not borrow to deal with the impasse before us, then there will have to be a resorting to very harsh and austere measures. Because as the last speaker pointed out, the question of the mortgaging of our future, of generations yet unborn, is behind all of this. The motion brought before the House last week, I think it was, by Senator Mark on the whole question of sustainability, I think is relevant. I think it is pertinent as a backdrop against which much of the discussion here today should be placed. Because at the end of the day, whether we opt for taxation as the method to resolve the problem before us, increase taxation so as to raise revenue, whether we go for budget cuts, in other words, reduce expenditure so as to, again, affect expenditure, affect, the revenue streams necessary, whether we go for layoffs, and that has begun to happen, not in the state sector, but it has begun to happen, or whether we propose sale of assets. Because you see, it has become almost the norm since under the regimes of the 70s into the 80s, that the state involvement in enterprise has been taken for granted. And we seem not to be asking the question as to whether this should continue. Initially, the role was that, okay, local capital development, local capital was basically underdeveloped, and the state needed to use some of the windfall from the oil boom to stimulate growth in other sectors. But we seem to have lost the original direction in the sense that the state has continued to play this capitalist role, and we have virtually developed a state capitalist model with no recourse to moving on, so that if we identified a sector that needed stimulation, one would have expected at some point in time the state would move on and dispose of the assets so organized and free up those funds to pursue some other area that was underdeveloped. So we have lost our way there, and this has implications for where we've now found ourselves and whether state assets should be disposed of as a means of dealing with the current financial impasse. The question, of course, of local borrowing is critical, and the solution set, whether a mix of local foreign borrowing even or disposal of assets, I'm not suggesting that any of these mechanisms are mutually exclusive. But what, if any, are there by way of less harsh measures, alternatives? And I want to argue that we should bear in mind that the most harsh alternative is the question of the valuation. And when it comes to the valuation as an alternative to this impasse, the valuation usually arises one of two ways: de facto or de jure. De jure being, of course, when the state accepts that it has to go that way or is forced there by the IMF. De facto is when you attempt to trade your dollar any place else but in your own country, and you realize what people are willing, or in fact they may be unwilling, to keep or hold the TT dollar. And along the line of alternatives, what about renegotiation? Is that possible? Could we sit with the people whom the state owes and discuss other options other than immediate payment? Is that on the cards? Has the government thus far explored this as an option? Has anyone filed any matters before the court?
Thank the Honourable Senator for giving way. We are in active discussion with all of these creditors all the time to see if we can negotiate away the penalties that were put into the contracts and reschedule the arrangements and so on. I'm talking about $11 billion in outstanding contracts that we have to get borrowings for now. We talk to them every day. So I'm just letting you know the answer is yes.
Thank you. The bottom line in all of this is that there is need for review, need for reassessment of what we have been doing and what is to be done. As I've said before in an earlier address, the definition of madness sometimes is doing the same thing and expecting different results. We have, in terms of our industrial development program, been doing much of the same thing. The question is, furtherance of that style, would it yield different results? One of the things, that managers and management has to always consider is the need sometimes to do things differently, or the need to do different things. Because lest we find ourselves resorting to the same old sterile prescriptive remedies. You see, we have to fashion a new way, a way in which we perceive ourselves as masters of our own destiny, from object to subjects of history. But in order to do that, we have, as managers of our own economy, perhaps to indulge in some amount of SWOT analysis. The whole questions of the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, the threats that face us. And I want to suggest that some amount of that is necessary here before we get into acts of borrowing or any of the other measures, all of which I see as having dire effects in the long term. What then would be our strengths if we had to utilize the SWOT analysis to see where it could take us? I'm suggesting that the allied services, particularly the engineering services and capabilities which we have developed over the past 50 years, is one of the strengths that should be isolated for focus. And also the limited oil and gas finite stocks and the future use of these finite stocks as possibly another strength. I would add to that other service capabilities, such as in the finance sector or accounting and auditing capabilities, the health services that we have developed, those health professionals who are in fact in demand, the tourism sector as a service sector, and also the cultural products that we have fashioned, particularly since independence, as being the basis for another services industry and as being a strength. But what of our weaknesses? Oil and gas comes to mind again, because it is a limited or a finite quantity. And of course, with the rise of shale oil or shale gas, we understand the implications of that. And the whole broader question, not just oil and gas, but the broader question of energy and the question of transitioning inside and outside of energy, and outside of oil. We went from oil to gas. The question is, from gas to what? Have we begun to explore the what in terms of energy, the future of energy as a basis for activity, economic activity within our country? Is it going to be waste to energy? And that's why I keep referring to the role of the municipal corporations, because they are the custodians of domestic waste and the official disposers of domestic waste. Is it going to be ocean to energy? Is it going to be solar energy? Those are some of the questions with which we have to grapple if we are to find our way out of this mess, if we are not just to resort to short-term solutions. And I want to contend that borrowing is a short-term solution. And whether in the financial institutions, we recommend that when we are faced with a crisis, we will opt for a short-term solution. What of our other weaknesses? Basically, we are right back where we were when the state decided under Eric Williams to pursue that state capitalist model. Because the weakness then was the underdeveloped state of our capital markets, of the local capital markets, and the nature of the ownership of that local capital market. And generally the low level of financial entrepreneurialism that existed then and it would seem to me that exists now. And the question, of course, of labor costs and the attendant issue of labor productivity. Again, under the mantle of weakness. And to me, this is the greatest weakness. It's the question of the lack of an overarching philosophical position and the attendant policy prescriptions that would emanate from that. But what of opportunities? Well, adversity is, of course, opportunity in itself. Our greatest entrepreneurial achievement thus far as a nation is, of course, the development of the steel band. And the steel band movement, of course, was founded in adversity. Those of us who remember what Trinidad was like in the post-World War era into the 1930s would understand that adversity does generate tremendous possibility. The question is if we are able to see ourselves rising out of that situation, so that there's opportunity in adversity to set new perspectives, new policy perspectives, and particularly on the part of whatever government is in power, and to derive strategies from these new policy perspectives. Opportunity then to reset sustainable development goals. And I again wish to thank Senator Mark for having that on our agenda before this debate, so that again, against the backdrop of an understanding of the need for sustainable development goals, we must place this discussion. Opportunity. There's opportunity here for historical review, to understand the past, to come to terms with ourselves as a Caribbean civilization, of our place in the Americas. And I'm arguing that it is towards a material conception of history we must turn if we have to understand where we are, where we have been coming from, and where possibly we can go. You see, towards the end of the 14th and 15th century, and I'm always contending that if you don't know where you came from, you won't have a clue as to where to go. Towards the end of the 14th and 15th century, Europe was seen to be overpopulated. Could you believe that? Well, that was the perspective there. And that is what drove explorers like Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci and so on to venture forth. And in the end, yes, we in the Caribbean and the Americas, we solved Europe's problem. And then America was created out of that. And I'm talking now of USA as part of America, the continent. And then we solved America, that is USA's problems. Most of us in the third world have been party to that solution. And the question now arises, and I note some of the contractors owed mentioned by the finance minister, are we now to solve China's problems too? Because it would seem, excuse me, that we haven't got the memo. And the memo is that we can't keep on solving these great nations' problems while suspending our future. And I repeat, it is towards a materialist conception of history that we have to turn to understand where we are located, why we are here, and to determine where we must go. I think it was Walter Rodney who wrote about how Europe underdeveloped Africa. Well, if we understand that, then we will know and we will understand also, much more closer to us, although we underwent the same process, but much more closer to us, is the question of how the CIA fixed Allende in Chile. and how they fixed Jagan in Guyana too, even before Castro emerged, and how they stunted Cuba under Castro. And if we understand these things, then we understand that the challenge is about reintegrating our immersion into the world economy, that we have to pick our own points of entry. And if we do that, then we will be in a better position to develop sustainable goals. Because it will be goals that we have selected and not goals that have been selected for us. Threats. Remember, I'm trying to take you through a SWOT analysis of our situation. Threats. And to me, the single greatest threat, the others are downstream from that, but the single greatest threat is the absence of or the need for confidence in ourselves. In going forward, we need to repose a greater confidence in ourselves, Madam President. You see, our history, simply put, has been pre-Columbian, before Columbus came. It has been colonial, the development of the plantation economy in its various forms. It has been neo-colonial, the emergence of the new empires to the North Atlantic countries. And then there was documentary independence, when we were tricked out with a flag, an anthem, a little army of sorts, and told, go and face the world. At this juncture, our future really depends on us devising a new social contract. I referred in my inaugural speech to the Marlborough House expedition. We are yet to sit as a people and agree on a certain set standards, values, mores even. And I'm saying at this juncture, it's as good a point as any. And that's why I hear what the Minister of Finance is saying when he speaks of consultation. And I'm arguing that the longer we postpone, quote unquote, consultation, is the further our goals, our need to develop ourselves is going to elude us. We have finally to sit down and talk to each other, talks amongst ourselves. The time for the national panchayat has arrived. You see, we have to get down to the business of consultation building and agree on the path forward. And the thing is, we are lucky in a sense, because democracy, the concept of modern democracy, was developed out of these Greek nation states. And there's nothing like this tiny twin island nation state of ours for us to really get together and discuss these things. Let's discuss what should be our core sustainable development goals. And in doing so, it would be easy to develop a set of criteria for sustainable development goals. I'm arguing that that's the way forward. That instead of focusing on the things which divide us, the history which has exploited us, we need to focus on what we collectively wish to aspire to. And in that context, we have to recognize, and this is where the real world comes in, the role of foreign exchange in all of that. And I'm suggesting that these sustainable goals must recognize, firstly, the need to build capacity to feed ourselves. Whatever we do, however we spend the money that Senator Mark was inquiring about, we must deal with the question of our capacity to feed ourselves, and then our capacity to house ourselves, and then our capacity to make or manufacture and improve that manufacturing capability based on our proximity to surplus. And I'm saying proximity to surplus in the context that all great nations advance in their ability to, whatever they produce in surplus, to find ways to store it so that in time of want they can utilize it or they can make it available to others. So proximity to surplus does not necessarily mean what we may ourselves grow or make, but what may be produced elsewhere in the Americas and that is accessible to us. So it's whether local or foreign surplus for that matter. And of course, all of this against a background of the need to increase foreign exchange earnings while decreasing foreign exchange consumption. But all of this, of course, would require a foreign affairs ministry that is mandated to buttress the production of local goods and the export of same, and the refinement of local services and the export of same. And a trade ministry similarly mandated and armed with a must-do list of local goods and local services for which they must do something in terms of affecting the demand for it or the availability of it to other countries, to other jurisdictions. But what would such must-do goods involve? I'm suggesting it must include energy, and it must include food production, and it must include housing construction. Basic needs strategy. But it also must include consultation and a consultative approach in terms of defining other goods that should be on our basic shortlist. So what I've called is not, an exhaustive list. But I want to turn to the question of energy, because I think there are some misunderstandings about where we are with energy. And I think there was as I will permit me, there was a text going around this morning in terms of those news texts, and it read like this: oil hits 6-year low, Mittal lays off 480 workers. That has been making the rounds this morning. And I'm saying that that is significant. Because if we remember that after the oil boom and the attempts to diversify the economy was the development, and there was reference to it earlier by other speakers, to the development of Point Lisas and the development of steel and so on. But I think Mittal laying off 480 workers tells us that there's a myth, there's a bubble that is bursting around us as to the extent to which Point Lisas has delivered us. And I want to argue that we have to be careful on that score. We have to be careful that in the age of communication, you have to be careful to be boasting about achievements under a certain kind of industrialization. You're in the wrong era. The big countries don't go on past that. This is the age of information and communication, ICT. And therefore, if what we are involved in is not integrally linked to that, then we're really on the wrong boat, sailing on the wrong sea, heading nowhere again. A kind of middle passage. But must-do services, what are the must-do services? I'm seeing financial services, marketing, advertising services, credit union services, particularly as a subset of financial services. And I'm arguing that the time has come for the HDC to retreat in its role, just as the Ministry of Housing retreated before it. Time has come for HDC to retreat in its role and to stay at a central planning level, at a policy development level, at a project identification level, and allow other local institutions to run with the ball in terms of the actual construction of houses and the negotiation of mortgages. You see, the state has to use the assets that it has, and the state has the land, and the state has some expertise and experience in infrastructure development, talking about the basic infrastructure for houses. But the state has to realize that it has not been the most efficient machinery when it comes to the actual construction and distribution of these houses. And that within the financial sector, whether it's the banks, the insurance companies, or even the credit unions, that there is capacity there for handling that. And therefore, if the state retreats from that, and which is my overall position about the need for the state to retreat from some of its statist capitalist approaches and allow other sectors in the country to emerge, because they have developed to the point where they can assume that role. We are no longer where we were in the early 70s. And that has been part of the failure of the state thus far, whichever of the regimes that have been in power since the 80s. A failure to understand where we have reached and what are the skill sets that we have developed across the nation. The other must-do services, of course, related to culture and tourism. And the failure, really, of our whole developmental trust in that area. You see, the two are linked. You cannot in this age build a tourism model that in our situation, the sun, sea, and sand thing is quickly exhausted. Plus, we don't have as many beaches or as miles of beaches as they have in Florida, so let's face that fact. You know, we almost seem sometimes puerile when we're talking about beautiful beaches and there's a few 100 yards in Tobago. Our longest beach stretch is the Manzilla Mayaro, and that is the bluest of water, or whitest of sand, to be quite frank. So we really need to revisit what we are doing with tourism. And we really need to understand that it is a cultural derivative product that is our best bet. The mix of races and ethnicities and religions and so on that we have is really our strongest point. The Mandir on the sea, the temple on the sea, good. The steel band movement of itself, chutney, the Dragon Festival. Our state enterprises, our ministries must understand that that is the real, resource. And that oil is finite, but people keep on multiplying. And that is the real resource. And that is the basis for a new approach to culture and tourism. And as I have said before, the oil industry and the recording industry in Trinidad and Tobago are almost of the same vintage. But look at the difference between the two. And one has had the benefit of the state, whether it was the colonial state out of England, or whether it was the local state, the neo-colonial state. Fact is, one has had the benefit of promotions from that side, whereas the other has had mere tokenism for most of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And that is really sad. We've come a long way from the days when we dumped Roaring Lions Calypso in the Gulf, saying it was smart. But we haven't reached anywhere near where we need to be in recognition of local creative effort. And I say this in the week in which a local movie was launched at our local cinema houses. the extent to which the state has recognized that it has a responsibility to stimulate that industry and has done any kind of significant work is really pathetic. I keep emphasizing our appreciation of a materialist conception of history for us to understand where we have been, where we are, and where we need to go. The early exploration of the Americas had with it notions of El Dorado, of the finding of gold, of dreams of a gold empire, and so on. And then they shifted downwards and they settled for tobacco, and then sugar, and then cocoa and bananas, and then in our case, oil and gas, and then steel and methanol. And the little news clip that's on my phone that spoke about lowest in 6 years for oil price. Mittal lays off 480 workers. I think a bubble has been burst. We are right back where we were at the end of sugar. You know, I sometimes tell people the best thing that former Prime Minister Manning did for this country was to certify the debt of sugar, because we had been fooling around, probably giving all of us diabetes, tempting to subsidize and continue that sugar industry. So when he disbanded Caroni officially, that was to certify the
Senator
debt
Creese,
of sugar.
you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you. And we need now to begin writing the certificate of debt for oil and gas. And for those of us who think that the excursion into steel in Point Lisas and methanol and so on is our deliverance, you may have to ask for a second, pathological report from the pathologist. Autopsy, you may have to ask for a second autopsy, but I assure you, an autopsy is due if you're thinking that steel and methanol and so on is going to save us. That's, at this stage, an idle dream. You see, at the end of the day, oil is on its way out. The multinationals have propped it up for whatever reason, but they are just propping it up so they can continue to milk the transfer pricing and other arrangements, or they're just plain lazy, or they just don't know what's next. But the bottom line is, this is the age of ICT, and therefore, if whatever we are fashioning is not related to that, then really we're out of sync with how the world is traveling, and we will not be finding any solutions soon. I'm suggesting that the methodology implied when the Minister of Finance spoke to us at the budget presentation, that they were going to get into some amount of consultation. We need to sit and talk, and we need to agree on sustainable development goals. We need to come to terms with the fact that oil is at an end. You know, it reminds me of the time I saw a policeman giving somebody a ticket. And the person said, oh, go over, you're giving me a ticket. And the policeman said, I ain't giving you a parking ticket, you know. I am certifying the fact that you are parked under no parking sign. We ought not to wait to be certified. We ought not to wait for all these industries to be certified. We ought to know the time has come for us to sit and talk again, work out a new social contract, work out our own social relations, work out our own economic relations, and determine our way forward. And that increasing borrowing is really the shortest of short-term measures. We'll be right back at this point talking again, because if we do not develop the productive capacity necessary to pay back whatever we borrow, whether locally or foreign, we are simply marking time. And we cannot afford to continue like that. I thank you.
Honourable Senators, I'd like to revert to item 3 on the order paper. I am in receipt from the following correspondence from His Excellency the President. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago by His Excellency Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, ORTTSC, President and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. To Mr. Vasan Bharat. Whereas by the provisions of Section 40, subsection 2, subsection B, and 43(2)(e) of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, the President, in exercise of the power vested in him and acting in accordance with the advice of the Leader of the Opposition, is empowered to declare the seat of a senator to be vacant. Now, therefore, I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President as aforesaid, in exercise of the power vested in me by the said sections 40, subsection 2b, and 43, subsection 2e of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, do hereby declare the seat of you, Vasan Bharat, to be vacant with effect from the 7th of December, 2015. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President, St. Anne's, this 7th day of December, 2015. The Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, appointment of a senator. By His Excellency Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, ORTTSC, President and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Gerard Hadid. In exercise of the power vested in me by Section 40, subsection 2b of the Constitution of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, I, Anthony Thomas Aquinas Carmona, President as aforesaid, acting in accordance with the advice of the Leader of the Opposition, do hereby appoint you, Gerald Hadid, a senator with effect from the 7th of December, 2015. Given under my hand and the seal of the President of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago at the office of the President, St. Anne's, this 7th day of December, 2015. Honourable Senators, a senator is required to take the oath, so please stand.
I, Gerald Hadid, having been appointed a member of Parliament, do swear by Almighty God that I will bear true faith and allegiance to Trinidad and Tobago, will uphold the Constitution and the law, and will conscientiously and impartially discharge the responsibilities to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, upon which I am about to enter.
Honourable Senators, at this time we will take the lunch break. May I just remind everyone that the Caribbean Regional Workshop on Sustainability, Energy and Development is still ongoing, and therefore we have invited all the delegates from the conference to join us for lunch. So I'm asking all senators to extend the warm hospitality that Trinidadians and Tobagonians are known for to the delegates. We will resume at 2 p.m.
As indicated by the President of the Senate, the 7th sitting of the Senate in the first session of the 11th Parliament, that takes place on Tuesday, December 8th, 2015, is suspended. Stay with us here on Parliament Radio 105.5 FM and the Parliament channel. During the lunch break, we feature parliamentary personalities and we return to our coverage of today's sitting at 2 p.m.
Follow the Parliament of